My name is Margaret Hale. I'm 37 years old, and for most of my life, I've been described with words that sound kind but often mean something else. Steady, reasonable, the one who doesn't cause problems. People usually assume I'm someone who adapts easily, who accepts things as they are, who will eventually come around if given enough time. They mistake my calm for agreement, my silence for compliance, and my patience for permission. I don't correct them. I never really have. I grew up learning that love was something you earn by staying within the lines drawn for you. That being trusted meant being predictable. That being a good daughter meant not choosing anything that made other people uncomfortable, even if it made you smaller. From the outside, my life looked orderly, educated, stable, respectable. Inside, it was quieter than anyone realized. Not empty, just carefully contained. This story isn't about rebellion. It isn't about cutting people off in anger or proving a point dramatically. It's about what happens when a woman reaches the edge of what she can quietly endure, and instead of breaking, she chooses. At its center is my father, a man who believed deeply in structure, legacy, and control, though he would have called it guidance. For most of my life, I believed that loving him meant aligning my life with his expectations. Until I loved someone he didn't choose, someone who didn't fit into the future he had already decided for me. When my father disowned me, there was no shouting, no slammed doors, just a sentence delivered calmly that erased my place in his life as if it had never been secure to begin with. What followed wasn't chaos, it was clarity. Losing him felt like losing gravity. Everything familiar disappeared at once, but so did the weight I had been carrying without realizing it. The story you're about to hear is not about how I fought back. It's about how I stopped negotiating my existence. You'll hear about restraint, how it can be mistaken for weakness. You'll hear about silence, how it can become a deliberate act. And you'll hear about choice, how choosing yourself doesn't always look brave in the moment, but becomes freedom over time. I'm telling this now without bitterness and without asking you to judge anyone involved. I don't need villains for this story to be true. I only need honesty, because sometimes the most powerful shift in a person's life doesn't come from confrontation, but from the quiet decision to no longer live on borrowed terms. So before we go any further, let me ask you this gently. Have you ever stayed silent for so long that, when you finally chose yourself, it felt like losing everything and gaining something you couldn't yet name? Before my father disowned me, before love became a line I wasn't allowed to cross, I already understood my place in the family, though no one ever stated it out loud. I was the reliable one, not the favorite, not the impressive one, not the child whose choices sparked conversation or prideful stories told to strangers. I was the one who made things easier, the one who adapted, the one who didn't require explanation. In my family, that was considered a virtue. From an early age, I learned how to read a room before I spoke. I learned when to agree, when to stay quiet, and when to let someone else's opinion land as final, even if it replaced my own. I wasn't forced into silence. That's important to say. No one told me I couldn't speak. I simply learned that speaking changed nothing, while cooperation earned peace. So I cooperated. At family gatherings, my father would talk about plans, his plans, careers he respected, lifestyles he approved of, futures that made sense to him. When relatives asked what I wanted, he often answered for me, confidently, as if my inner world had already been translated into something more acceptable. I never corrected him. People assumed that meant alignment. I agreed with his vision because I didn't challenge it. What they didn't see was how often I stepped back, quietly adjusting myself to fit into expectations that were never shaped around me. To my father, I was dependable. To my extended family, I was doing fine. To everyone else, I was unremarkable in the safest possible way. There's a strange kind of invisibility that comes with being low maintenance. When you don't ask for much, people forget you might need anything at all. Your emotional life becomes theoretical, something others assume is simple because it isn't noisy. I didn't protest that version of myself. I maintained it. I went to the schools that made sense. I chose the career that didn't alarm anyone. I dated people who were, at the very least, neutral. People my father could tolerate even if he didn't fully approve. And when relationships ended quietly, as many did, no one asked whether I was hurt. They assumed I was practical about it. Margaret always is. That was the role. The woman who absorbs disappointment without spilling it. Looking back, I can see how carefully that identity was reinforced. When I compromised, I was praised for being mature. When I stayed quiet, I was admired for being composed. When I sacrificed something personal, it was reframed as wisdom. No one asked what it cost me, and I didn't offer the answer. My father wasn't cruel. That matters. He believed in order, in structure, in the idea that love was best expressed through guidance, not flexibility. In his mind, steering my life was an act of care. Resistance, therefore, looked like immaturity. Independence looked like ingratitude. So I learned to be agreeable in ways that didn't look like fear. I told myself I was choosing harmony, that I was being patient, that this was temporary. But years have a way of turning temporary into a lifestyle. I became skilled at being useful, at smoothing tension, being the person everyone could rely on to do the right thing, even if no one defined what right meant for me. And the more I fulfilled that role, the more fixed it became. By the time I fell in love with someone entirely outside the future my father had designed for me, I didn't yet realize how fragile my position was. I believed genuinely that my history of obedience had earned me understanding, that being the good daughter for so long had created some margin for choice. I was wrong, but at this point in the story, I didn't know that yet. All I knew was who I had been to them, the quiet constant, the adaptable presence, the daughter who fit until fitting required disappearing. And I had not yet decided whether I was willing to do that. The first time I felt something shift, it wasn't during an argument. There was no raised voice, no obvious conflict. In fact, if you had been in the room, you might not have noticed anything at all. That's what made it stay with me. I had been seeing him for a few months by then, quietly, carefully, not because I was ashamed, But because I wasn't ready to translate something new into a language my father would immediately evaluate, it felt personal in a way I hadn't experienced before, unmeasured, unapproved, and therefore fragile. When I finally mentioned him to my father, I didn't dramatize it. I spoke the way I always had, calmly, respectfully, without asking for permission. Just information, offered neutrally. My father listened. He nodded once, and then he asked a question that, on the surface, sounded reasonable. What does he do? Not who he was, not how he treated me, not whether I was happy. What does he do? I answered. Briefly, honestly. There was a pause after that, not a long one, just long enough to register. Then my father said, "That doesn't sound very stable." He said it the way people comment on the weather. No accusation, no concern, just a conclusion already formed. No one else reacted. My mother continued clearing the table. The conversation shifted. A new topic replaced the old one, seamlessly. It was over before it had begun. But something in me stayed alert. Because that moment wasn't about disapproval. It was about dismissal, a subtle repositioning, a reminder of hierarchy. My choice had been evaluated, found lacking, and filed away without discussion. I didn't defend him. I didn't argue. I told myself it wasn't worth it. That was my first mistake. Over the next few weeks, small comments appeared. Never direct, never confrontational, just enough to register if you were paying attention. Long-term plans matter. People show you who they are through ambition. Love isn't enough if the foundation isn't right. Each sentence floated into the room and settled somewhere near me, never addressed to me directly, never followed by a question. Everyone else heard them as general wisdom. I heard them as corrections. I noticed how my father stopped asking about my life in the way he used to. Conversations became transactional, surface level, efficient. The warmth didn't vanish, it cooled. And because nothing dramatic happened, I questioned myself. Was I being sensitive, reading too much into it, projecting meaning where none was intended? That doubt is powerful. It makes you complicit in your own minimization. At one point, my father mentioned a family friend's daughter who had chosen wisely and was set up properly. The comparison wasn't explicit. It didn't need to be. I understood exactly where I stood in contrast. Still, I stayed quiet. I had spent years being praised for not making things difficult. I wasn't about to disrupt that over something so subtle. Nothing had been said outright. No ultimatums had been given. I still believed, on some level, that this was a phase, that once my father saw how consistent, respectful, and real this relationship was, he would adjust. That belief kept me silent, but silence has a cost, even when it feels strategic, because the first small cut isn't meant to wound deeply. It's meant to test, to see whether you'll flinch, whether you'll push back, or whether you'll absorb it and stay in place. I absorbed it, and in doing so, I unknowingly confirmed something to my father, that my boundaries were flexible, that my choices were negotiable, that my silence could be interpreted as agreement. That moment at the table, brief, forgettable to everyone else, became a reference point for me, the place where I could trace the beginning of something I would later understand more clearly. At the time, I only felt a faint discomfort, a sense that something had shifted off balance, just slightly. Not enough to act on, not enough to name, but enough to remember. And I did. Once the first boundary is crossed quietly, it becomes easier to cross again. Nothing overtly changed after that initial conversation. There were no confrontations, no dramatic declarations. Instead, there was a slow recalibration of how I was spoken to and how my life was referenced, if it was referenced at all. My father didn't forbid the relationship. He didn't criticize me directly. He simply began treating that part of my life as a temporary error, something best ignored until it corrected itself. At first, I told myself this was restraint on his part, that he was choosing patience, that his silence meant he was giving me space. That interpretation made it easier to stay calm, but over time, the pattern became harder to ignore. When I mentioned my partner in passing, nothing emotional, just a detail, my father would redirect the conversation within seconds. A work update, a family obligation, a practical concern. The message was subtle but consistent. This subject did not belong. At gatherings, he would ask about my job, my apartment, and my schedule. Never about who I spent my time with. Never about what made me happy. When relatives asked questions, he often answered for me, steering the narrative back to what he considered stable ground. She's focused on her career right now. She's always been sensible. It sounded supportive. It felt erasing. What made it more confusing was that nothing was hostile. My father remained polite, helpful even. He offered advice, shared articles, checked in about work stress. To anyone observing from the outside, our relationship looked intact. That's how normalization works. When discomfort arrives without drama, you adjust to it. You begin to accept what would have once felt unacceptable. I told myself this was a generational difference, that he needed time, that pushing would only create resistance. I told myself I was being mature by not escalating something that didn't yet require it. But the truth was simpler and less flattering. I was afraid of losing my place. I had spent so long being the easy daughter that I didn't know how to be anything else without consequence. The cost of compliance had always felt manageable. The cost of disruption felt unknown. So I managed the situation internally instead. I edited my language. I shared less. I learned which topics to soften and which to avoid altogether. Without realizing it, I began living a divided life. One version of myself existed in my own space, where my relationship was real, present, and emotionally grounded. Another version existed in my family's orbit, where that part of me was minimized into irrelevance. That split didn't happen overnight. It crept in through repetition. Every redirected conversation, every "that's not practical," every comparison is disguised as advice. And each time I let it pass, I wasn't silent because I agreed. I was silent because I believed endurance was safer than confrontation. I believed that if I remained consistent, reasonable, and respectful, the imbalance would eventually correct itself. What I didn't understand yet was that consistency, when met with control, becomes a tool for the person in power, not the one adapting. The most difficult part wasn't what my father said. It was what he no longer needed to say. The expectations were implied now, clear without being spoken. This will pass. You will come around. We don't need to discuss this further. And because I didn't challenge those assumptions, they hardened. I remember one evening when my father mentioned future plans, holidays, relocations, long-term arrangements. He spoke as if my life trajectory were still fully aligned with his vision, as if nothing had changed. I listened. I nodded. I didn't interrupt. Inside, something tightened. That was the moment I realized the disrespect wasn't episodic. It was structural. My autonomy had been downgraded quietly, politely, under the guise of concern. Still, I stayed. I told myself that love sometimes required patience, that timing mattered, that pushing too early could destroy something salvageable. Those rationalizations sounded reasonable. They also kept me in place. By normalizing the dismissal of my choices, I was teaching my father something without words, that my life could be discussed without my consent, that my silence meant flexibility, that my boundaries were theoretical. I didn't see it as disrespect at the time. I saw it as a compromise. Only later would I understand the difference. At this stage of the story, I still believed that staying quiet was a form of control, that by not reacting, I was maintaining stability. I didn't yet realize that I was slowly being written out of decisions about my own life, and that silence, once normalized, would eventually be expected. By the time I understood the role my family expected me to play, I had already been performing it for years. It wasn't assigned in a single conversation. No one sat me down and explained the terms. It was shaped through repetition, through what was rewarded, what was ignored, and what quietly created friction when I stepped outside it. I was the stabilizer, the one who adjusted so others didn't have to, the one who absorbed discomfort so the atmosphere could remain calm, the daughter whose presence reassured everyone that nothing was out of control. In that role, my usefulness was undeniable. My individuality was optional. My father trusted me because I didn't surprise him, because I fit into the systems he valued: planning, predictability, image. He relied on me to show up on time, make sensible choices, and not complicate narratives he had already written. And I complied, not because I lacked a sense of self, but because I believed harmony was a form of responsibility. When the extended family needed help, I was called. When plans needed coordination, I handled it. When emotional tension appeared, I softened it. I became fluent in anticipation, learning what was expected before it was asked. That skill was praised. It was also confining, because once you become the person who has it handled, people stop asking whether you should be handling it at all. My father often spoke about family in terms of structure, roles, contribution, legacy. In his worldview, everyone had a place. My place was clear, dependable, low risk, supportive. Love in that system wasn't about understanding, it was about alignment. The problem was that alignment required me to remain legible to him, predictable, adjustable. When I chose something that couldn't be easily absorbed into his framework, the system didn't expand. It tightened. I noticed it in how conversations shifted when I asserted even mild preferences. A suggestion met with silence. A choice reframed as impractical, not argued against, just gently redirected. The message was consistent. Your role is not to decide. Your role is to adapt. And because I had benefited from that role for so long, through approval, stability, and belonging, I hesitated to question it. Challenging it felt ungrateful, disruptive, excessive, so I continued to perform. I showed up. I smiled when appropriate. I withheld information that might complicate things. From the outside, I looked cooperative, mature, reasonable. Inside, I was becoming less visible to myself. The realization didn't arrive dramatically. It came in a quiet moment, after another family dinner where my future had been discussed, as if it were still under negotiation. I sat alone later that night and recognized a familiar pattern. My life was being planned around me, not with me. That's when it became clear. I wasn't valued for who I was becoming. I was valued for how little resistance I offered. That understanding didn't make me angry. It made me precise. Because once you see the role clearly, you also see its limits. I saw how conditional my position was, how easily it could be withdrawn if I disrupted the balance, how much of my worth in my father's eyes depended on my continued compliance. And I saw something else too. I saw how much effort it took to remain invisible, holding back opinions, filtering truth, managing reactions. It wasn't sustainable, and it wasn't neutral. It was a slow erosion disguised as peace. Still, at this stage, I didn't confront anyone. I didn't announce a shift. I didn't demand recognition. I simply stopped assuming that my role was permanent. That subtle internal separation between who I was expected to be and who I was becoming marked the beginning of something important. I hadn't left yet. I hadn't chosen differently yet. But I had stopped confusing usefulness with love. And once that distinction is made, it's impossible to unsee. The day something shifted didn't announce itself. There was no argument, no ultimatum, no irreversible moment that demanded immediate action. In fact, it looked like an ordinary day, quiet, structured, familiar. That's how most real changes begin. I was visiting my parents for the weekend. The routine was unchanged. Dinner at the same time, the same seating arrangement, the same careful rhythm of conversation. My father spoke about work, about plans, about things that moved in straight lines. At some point, he mentioned my future again, not as a question, as an assumption. He talked about where I might relocate one day, about opportunities that would make sense long term, about decisions that would keep everything clean. He spoke with confidence, the kind that comes from believing your authority is still intact. I listened. I nodded when appropriate. I offered neutral responses. And then something in me went very still. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness. It was recognition. I realized that my father wasn't waiting for me to choose. He was waiting for me to comply. The distinction mattered more than anything he had said. Up until that point, I had believed time was the missing ingredient, that with enough consistency, my life would be accepted as it was, that my silence was buying me space. In that moment, I understood that silence was doing the opposite. It was preserving an illusion, one where my autonomy remained theoretical, where my adulthood was conditional, where my choices were tolerated only as long as they remained reversible. Sitting there, I saw the shape of my future clearly for the first time. If I stayed quiet, nothing would change. If I stayed agreeable, my life would continue to be discussed without my consent. If I waited for permission, it would never come. The realization was calm, almost clinical. I didn't feel the urge to defend myself. I didn't need to argue my worth. I simply saw that the version of me my father was invested in no longer existed, and he hadn't noticed. That was the shift. I remember excusing myself later and standing alone in the bathroom, looking at my reflection. There was no dramatic emotion on my face, just a steadiness I hadn't felt before. I thought about my partner, about how being with him felt uncomplicated in a way I hadn't known was possible. How I didn't have to translate myself or minimize parts of my life to be accepted. And I realized something else, just as quietly. I wasn't afraid of losing my father anymore. That doesn't mean I didn't care. It means the fear no longer governed my decisions. The weight I had been carrying, the constant calculation, the careful phrasing, the strategic silence, lifted in that moment. Not because the situation had improved, but because my understanding of it had changed. I returned to the table composed. I didn't announce anything. I didn't correct my father. I finished the evening exactly as it began. No one noticed a difference, but internally I had crossed a line I wouldn't step back over. I stopped waiting for understanding. I stopped preparing explanations. I stopped hoping my choices would eventually feel acceptable to someone who needed control more than connection. That night, lying awake, I didn't make a plan. I didn't outline the next steps. I didn't rehearse conversations. I simply accepted a truth I had been avoiding, that staying required me to become smaller, and leaving would require me to stand alone. And for the first time, standing alone didn't feel like failure. It felt honest. From the outside, nothing had shifted. The next morning followed the same routine. My father was polite, predictable, certain. But inside me, silence had changed its meaning. It was no longer avoidance. It was no longer fear. It was preparation. After that weekend, I didn't confront anyone. I didn't announce a decision. From the outside, my behavior remained consistent enough to be unremarkable. That was intentional. Silence had always been my default, but now it served a different purpose. Before, it was a reflex, something I used to avoid friction. Now, it was a deliberate choice. I stopped correcting assumptions. When my father spoke about my future as if it were still open to his interpretation, I let him. When he framed my life in ways that excluded the person I loved, I didn't intervene. Not because I agreed, but because I no longer felt the need to negotiate my reality in spaces that refused to acknowledge it. This new silence wasn't empty. It was focused. I observed more carefully. I noticed how my father interpreted my restraint, not as independence, but as hesitation. To him, my lack of resistance confirmed what he already believed, that I would eventually fall back into alignment. That misunderstanding worked in my favor. He relaxed. The subtle pressure remained, but it softened. Without pushback, there was no need to escalate. The system returned to what it knew best, assuming compliance. Meanwhile, I made internal adjustments. I shared less about my personal life. I stopped offering context that could be reshaped into something more acceptable. Conversations became efficient, polite, shallow. My partner noticed the shift first. He didn't push for explanations. He didn't interpret my quiet as doubt. He simply stayed present. That mattered more than he knew. I began to see how often silence is mistaken for weakness, especially in women. How calm is read as uncertainty. How restraint is interpreted as indecision. I let that misinterpretation stand. Because while nothing appeared to be happening, something very real was taking shape. I reviewed my finances, not out of urgency, but out of clarity. I looked at what I had built quietly over the years: savings, independence, options I had never needed to articulate because I had never planned to use them. I updated the documents, made sure everything important was in order. I didn't dramatize it. I treated it the way I treated everything else in my life, methodically. I also stopped seeking reassurance. That was the hardest shift. I had been conditioned to measure the safety of my choices by how little resistance they provoked. Letting go of that reflex required discipline. Each time I felt the urge to explain myself, I paused. I asked whether understanding was actually possible in that context. Most of the time, it wasn't. So I stayed quiet, not withdrawn, not resentful, just contained. The people around me filled that silence with their own interpretations. My father assumed patience. My mother assumed temporary confusion. Extended family assumed nothing at all. No one assumed intention. That was the advantage. Silence, when chosen, creates space. And space reveals patterns you couldn't see while you were reacting. I began to understand how power operated in my family, not through volume, but through assumption. Whoever defined the narrative earliest controlled the outcome. I stopped trying to correct the narrative. I focused on redefining my position within it. There was no urgency, no rush to act. I wasn't trying to win anything. I was preparing to step out of a structure that no longer recognized me. From the outside, I was still the same: reliable, composed, cooperative. Inside, I was detached in a way that felt new and necessary. Silence had become my boundary, and boundaries don't always need to be announced to be effective. Sometimes they're strongest when they're invisible. The people who underestimated me mistook that invisibility for absence. They didn't realize I was still there, watching, learning, and choosing the moment when silence would no longer be required. What they never noticed was how much attention I was paying while saying very little. Silence gave me access. Without the distraction of defending myself, I began to see the structure of my family and my place within it with unusual clarity. I noticed which assumptions were fixed and which were fragile. I noticed how decisions were made, and more importantly, who was never consulted. My father spoke with certainty, but his certainty depended on predictability. He was comfortable when outcomes followed patterns he understood. Anything that couldn't be anticipated unsettled him. That knowledge mattered. I also noticed how little practical support I actually received. Emotional approval, yes, when I stayed within bounds. Advice, frequently. But when I stepped back and assessed my life objectively, I realized something quietly empowering. I was already operating independently. My job paid my bills. My savings covered emergencies. My relationships existed without family endorsement. There was no safety net to lose because I had built my own. That realization didn't arrive with triumph. It arrived with precision. I began documenting things, Not obsessively, just responsibly. Financial records, legal details, the unglamorous infrastructure of autonomy. I made sure my name stood alone where it needed to. I checked what assumptions I had been making about shared resources, shared obligations, and shared futures. Most of them were outdated. I also learned to stop reacting emotionally to subtle provocations. When comments surfaced about stability, about practicality, about waiting things out, I registered them without internalizing them. They became data points instead of wounds. Each one confirmed what I already knew. My father wasn't negotiating, he was managing. And management only works when the other party remains accessible. I reduced that access quietly. Phone calls became shorter. Updates became factual. I stopped volunteering future plans that could be preemptively shaped. To anyone observing, it looked like nothing more than a busy adult life. People drift apart all the time. No alarms were triggered. What they didn't see was the positioning. I learned how to exit systems without collapse, how to untangle emotional dependence from practical logistics, how to prepare for loss without dramatizing it. I also paid attention to myself. I noticed how my body responded when I stopped anticipating disapproval, how my shoulders relaxed, how decisions felt cleaner when they didn't need to pass an invisible approval process. I spent time clarifying what I actually wanted, not what made sense, not what was impressive, not what would be easiest to explain, just what felt aligned. That clarity was new. For years, my preferences had been filtered through a question I rarely questioned. Will this be acceptable? Removing that filter changed everything. I didn't announce this shift to my partner either. He didn't need to know the details. He trusted me. That trust created a stability I had never experienced in my family dynamic. I began to understand something fundamental about power. It isn't loud, it doesn't rush, and it doesn't need validation. True leverage comes from being prepared to accept outcomes others are trying to avoid. My father's authority relied on the assumption that I feared disconnection more than misalignment. Once that assumption stopped being true, the balance shifted, even if he couldn't see it yet. I wasn't plotting revenge. I wasn't building a case. I wasn't waiting for the right argument. I was preparing for a reality where approval was no longer a resource I depended on. That preparation was invisible because it didn't disrupt anything. It simply made me less tethered. I understood now why silence had been misread for so long. People assume the quietest person in the room has the least influence. They rarely consider that quiet might mean complete internal alignment. By the time my father sensed that something was different, the foundations had already shifted. He just didn't know it yet, and neither did anyone else. The reveal didn't come with excitement. There was no surge of adrenaline, no feeling of triumph. What I felt instead was something quieter and far more stabilizing. Clarity. It arrived one evening while I was sitting alone at my kitchen table, papers spread out in front of me. Nothing dramatic. Bank statements, legal documents, notes I had accumulated over months without urgency. I wasn't searching for leverage. I wasn't trying to gain power over anyone. I was simply verifying reality, and reality, once seen clearly, has a way of rearranging your sense of position. I realized then how much influence my father believed he still had, and how little of it was grounded in fact. His authority existed almost entirely in narrative form, tradition, expectation, emotional gravity, but materially, practically, legally, there was nothing left to withdraw. My education was mine. My income was mine. My home was mine. Even the future he spoke about so confidently required my participation to exist. That was the private reveal. Not that I had power over him, but that he no longer had power over me. I sat with that understanding for a long time. What surprised me most wasn't relief. It was how ordinary it felt, like discovering that a door you'd been guarding for years was never locked to begin with. I thought back to all the calculations I had made, what I could risk saying, how much resistance I could afford, when I should wait instead of act. All of that effort had been built around an assumption that disapproval equaled danger. It didn't. The danger had always been internal, remaining in a life that required constant permission. This realization didn't make me reckless, it made me exact. I stopped imagining conversations that would never happen, stopped rehearsing explanations for people who weren't listening, stopped hoping that being understood would somehow make my choice safer. I understood now that understanding was optional. Consent was not. I didn't tell anyone about this shift. Not my partner, not my friends. This clarity was private, and it needed to stay that way. Once spoken aloud, it could be challenged, minimized, or reframed. Silence protected it. In the days that followed, I noticed how differently I moved through the world. Not visibly, but internally. Decisions no longer carried the same weight. They felt grounded instead of tentative. When my father made assumptions, I no longer felt the urge to correct him. His version of my future was irrelevant now. Not wrong, just disconnected from anything that required my agreement. That distinction mattered. I also noticed how power reacts to invisibility. When someone believes you're still operating under their influence, they don't guard their behavior. They continue as before. They reveal their limits without realizing it. My father spoke more openly about his expectations, about what he believed would eventually resolve itself. He wasn't threatening. He was certain. Certainly, I realized, is brittle when it isn't backed by reality. Still, I felt no urge to expose that brittleness. There was nothing to gain from it. This wasn't about winning an argument. It was about choosing a life that didn't require constant self-editing. The leverage I had discovered wasn't a weapon. It was an exit. And exits don't need to be announced to be effective. I remember thinking very clearly, I can leave without asking, not dramatically, not angrily, just completely. That understanding settled into me with a calm I hadn't known before. The tension I had normalized for years dissolved, not because circumstances had improved, but because my dependence on them had ended. I didn't rush toward the door. I stayed exactly where I was, outwardly unchanged. But internally, the relationship had already shifted. My father still believed the story was unfinished, that time would correct what he saw as deviation, that my silence meant uncertainty. He didn't know that the decision had already been made, quietly, without ceremony, and that when the moment came, it wouldn't be fueled by anger, but by alignment. That was the private reveal, not power gained, just illusion removed. The decision point didn't feel urgent. That was the most deceptive part of it. There were still multiple paths available to me, or at least they appeared that way on the surface. I could continue as I was, quiet, contained, selectively present. I could attempt another round of careful explanations, hoping clarity might finally shift something that had resisted it for years. Or I could choose distance, not as punishment, but as fact. Each option carried consequences. Staying meant preserving access to family gatherings, to the illusion of approval, to a version of belonging that had always been conditional but familiar. Leaving meant finality, not necessarily forever, but enough to change the relationship irreversibly. It meant accepting that some people don't adapt when the rules change, they only withdraw. I weighed those outcomes carefully. What made the decision unavoidable wasn't pressure from my father, it was something quieter, a growing misalignment between who I was becoming and the life I was still performing in certain spaces. I noticed it in small moments, how my body tightened before phone calls, how I delayed sharing good news, how I instinctively edited joy before presenting it. Those were signals. A life that requires constant self-correction isn't stable. It's constrained. I also considered timing. Waiting felt easier in theory. There was no crisis forcing my hand, no dramatic event demanding resolution. But I understood something now that I hadn't before. Waiting wouldn't make the choice safer. It would only make it less conscious. If I didn't choose, I would drift. And drifting had already cost me years. The irreversible option wasn't cutting contact. It wasn't a confrontation. It was alignment, choosing to live in a way that no longer leaves room for negotiation about my autonomy. That choice didn't require a conversation. It required commitment. I decided that my relationship with my partner, with my life, would no longer exist in parallel to my family. It would exist as the primary reality. That meant if conflict arose, it would not be managed. It would be accepted. I knew what that likely meant with my father. He was a man who equated agreement with respect. Deviation, to him, was rejection. I didn't underestimate the cost. I grieved the version of him who might have adjusted. I grieved the father I wished he could be, curious, flexible, capable of seeing my adulthood without framing it as loss. But grief clarified something important. I was no longer making decisions to preserve a relationship that required my diminishment. That understanding hardened into resolve. I didn't rehearse speeches. I didn't outline boundaries. I simply stopped creating space for alternatives. When invitations came, I assessed them honestly. When conversations edged toward control, I didn't soften my stance. I answered directly, without explanation. I'm happy with my choices. This works for me. No qualifiers, no justifications. Those sentences landed differently. My father noticed the shift, not as clarity, but as resistance. The atmosphere changed. There was tension now, unspoken, but present. That was expected. What surprised me was how little fear accompanied it. The choice, once made, was stabilizing. It simplified everything. There was no longer a need to manage perceptions or maintain ambiguity. I wasn't asking to be understood. I was informing reality. This decision point didn't come with applause. It came with consequences. Some immediate, some delayed. But it was irreversible in the most important way. I no longer saw myself as someone waiting to be allowed to live fully. I had chosen alignment over approval, and once that choice is made honestly, every other option fades. Once the decision was made, I didn't announce it. I didn't mark it with a conversation or a declaration. I simply began to live as though the choice were already irreversible, because internally it was. From the outside, nothing appeared to change. That was the advantage. I continued my routines. I showed up to work. I responded to messages when necessary. I remained polite, composed, and emotionally consistent. There was no withdrawal dramatic enough to trigger concern. What changed was structural. I finalized practical matters I had previously kept flexible out of habit. I reviewed long-term plans with my partner, not as possibilities, but as intentions. We talked about timelines, not hypotheticals. We made decisions that assumed continuity. I ensured that every part of my life reflected that assumption. Finances were already independent, but I simplified them further. Fewer shared obligations, clearer lines, nothing reactive, just clean design. I wanted my life to function without requiring negotiation with anyone outside it. I also adjusted how accessible I was, not abruptly, gradually. I stopped rearranging my schedule to accommodate expectations that were never reciprocated. I declined invitations that required emotional labor I was no longer willing to provide. I stopped explaining why. I won't be able to make it. No elaboration, no apology. Silence did the rest. No one confronted me about these changes. They were too subtle, too reasonable. People rarely question boundaries when they're introduced quietly and enforced consistently. My father noticed less than he should have. He assumed distance was temporary, that my focus would eventually return, that my choices would soften with time. He didn't see that time was no longer working in his favor. I was no longer managing outcomes. I was letting them occur. That distinction mattered. Moving in silence isn't about secrecy. It's about not inviting interference. Every step I took was visible in hindsight, but unremarkable in real time. I stopped signaling uncertainty. I stopped asking indirect permission. I stopped positioning my life as open for revision. That stability unsettled some people, though they couldn't articulate why. My father began offering more advice, unsolicited but calm. He framed it as concern, as foresight, as wisdom is earned through experience. I listened without absorbing it. Advice loses its power when it's no longer needed. There was a moment, quiet, forgettable, when I realized how far things had shifted. My father referenced a future event and spoke as if I would naturally participate. I responded evenly. That won't work for me. He paused, just briefly. No argument followed, but something registered. From that point on, his tone changed. Not louder, more deliberate, as if he were recalculating. Still, no one understood what was actually happening. They thought I was busy. They thought I was distracted. They thought this was a phase. I let them think that, because movement doesn't need witnesses to be effective. I wasn't distancing myself emotionally out of resentment. I was aligning my actions with a decision that had already been made. That alignment made everything feel lighter, even as the tension increased. The irony was that by the time my father began to sense loss, the infrastructure of my life no longer included him as an authority figure. He still believed there would be a conversation that would restore order, that clarity could be negotiated. He didn't realize that the order had already been redefined, and that I wasn't moving away from him. I was moving toward myself. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They unfolded gradually, in ways that were easy to dismiss at first. Small disruptions, subtle absences, moments that felt slightly off without anyone being able to name why. That's how loss often begins when no one is paying attention. My father was the first to sense it, though he wouldn't have described it that way. He noticed changes in availability, in responsiveness, in how little influence his opinions seemed to carry. Conversations that once followed predictable patterns now ended sooner. Invitations were declined without replacement plans. Nothing confrontational, nothing dramatic, just less access. At first, he treated it as an inconvenience. He adjusted, repeated himself more, reasserted expectations gently, as if clarity had been temporarily lost and simply needed reinforcement. But reinforcement only works when the structure is still intact. Mine wasn't. My absence began to register indirectly. A family gathering where my role went unfilled. A responsibility I used to manage that someone else now had to handle poorly. A moment of tension that no one smoothed over. People felt the shift before they understood it. I heard about it secondhand. Things feel different lately. You've been hard to pin down. Your dad seems a little unsettled. None of it was accusatory. None of it was explicit. But the undertone was clear. The system was adjusting to a missing stabilizer. My father reached out more often, not urgently, casually. He asked neutral questions, then followed them with suggestions about timing, about practicality, about revisiting certain assumptions. I responded politely, briefly. I didn't argue. I didn't justify. I didn't reopen discussions that had already closed internally. That restraint unsettled him more than resistance would have. When people expect negotiation and encounter finality, they often mistake it for coldness. But this wasn't emotional withdrawal. It was clarity. The consequences became more visible over time. Plans were made without confirming my involvement, and then had to be revised. Decisions were delayed because my input was no longer guaranteed. The quiet efficiency I had provided for years was gone. And because I hadn't announced my exit, no one knew how to replace me. My father grew frustrated, not with me directly, but with the situation. He began speaking in hypotheticals again, about how things used to work, about how families function best when everyone understands their role. The irony wasn't lost on me. What he felt wasn't betrayal. It was disorientation. He had believed my presence was permanent because it had never been challenged. Now, without warning, it was conditional, and he didn't know on what terms. That uncertainty was new for him. For me, it was familiar. I watched these shifts without satisfaction. There was no sense of vindication, just confirmation. Confirmation that my value had been tied to function, not agency. Confirmation that when the function is withdrawn, discomfort follows. Confirmation that my silence had protected a system that couldn't sustain itself without my compliance. Still, I didn't step in to fix anything. I let the discomfort exist. That was the hardest part. Not intervening, not smoothing, not reassuring. Letting people experience the natural consequences of a structure that had relied too heavily on my adaptability. My father eventually asked to meet, not directly about conflict, just to talk things through. I agreed, not because I hoped to resolve anything, but because I was no longer avoiding what came next. By then, the consequences were no longer subtle. They were personal. When we met, my father arrived with a version of calm I recognized well. It was the calm he used when he believed control was still possible, when the situation hadn't yet slipped beyond adjustment. He spoke first about timing, about misunderstandings, about how things had drifted unnecessarily. His language was careful, managerial. He framed the distance between us as a logistical error, not a relational one. I listened. He suggested we reset, that we clarify expectations, that we return to what worked before. That was when I understood something important. He believed the problem was recent. He thought this could still be fixed. I told him gently that nothing had drifted, that I had made deliberate choices, that my life had changed in ways that weren't temporary. He paused. That pause was different from the others. It carried weight. He was recalculating, not yet panicked, but unsettled. He asked questions then, not about my feelings, but about implications. And when I answered plainly, without apology or defensiveness, the realization began to settle in. This wasn't a phase, this wasn't confusion, this wasn't negotiable. The conversation shifted tone. His calm tightened. He began referencing sacrifices, investments, years of guidance. I acknowledged them without retreating. That was the moment the urgency appeared. He spoke more quickly, less precisely. He warned me, softly, about consequences, about how choices reverberate, about how families remember. There was no anger in his voice. There was fear. Fear that his influence had ended. I didn't argue that point. There was nothing to argue. I told him that I loved him, but I wasn't willing to live a life that required ongoing permission. That my relationship, my choices, and my future were not open for restructuring. He listened, and then he said something that clarified everything. If you continue down this path, you're choosing to step outside this family. It wasn't delivered as a threat. It was a boundary. His. I recognized it immediately, and I accepted it. That acceptance startled him more than refusal would have. He expected negotiation, or grief, or hesitation. He didn't expect clarity. I told him I understood, that I respected his position, that I was sorry it had come to this, but that my decision stood. That was when panic surfaced. He backtracked slightly, reframed, suggested time, space, adjustments, anything that implied reversibility. But it was too late. Not because I was unwilling to reconsider, but because the choice had already reorganized my life. There was nothing left to return to. I wasn't leaving out of spite. I wasn't making a statement. I was living in alignment with a reality that no longer included conditional belonging. My father saw it then. The loss in his expression wasn't just about me. It was about control, about authority, about a structure he believed was permanent. He ended the conversation by restating his boundary. He couldn't support my choices. He wouldn't participate in a life he didn't recognize. In his words, he disowned me. The word itself landed softly, almost bureaucratic. What followed was silence, not dramatic, not explosive, just absence. I walked away from that meeting steady, not because it didn't hurt, but because it didn't surprise me. The opportunity to fix it had existed for years. It had passed quietly, unnoticed, and now nothing could reverse what had already been chosen. On both sides, there was no final argument after that meeting. No raised voices, no messages sent in the middle of the night. The disownment wasn't followed by chaos, it was followed by clarity. The confrontation, if it could be called that, had already happened. What remained was adjustment. My father reached out once more weeks later. The message was brief, neutral, practical. He asked whether I had reconsidered. I didn't rush to respond. When I did, my reply was simple. I haven't. No explanation. No emotion attached. That was the last direct exchange we had. What surprised me was not the finality, but the calm that accompanied it. I had spent years preparing for a rupture I assumed would devastate me. Instead, what I felt was a steady sadness, present, but not destabilizing. There was no urge to defend my choices, no need to convince anyone I was right. The outcome had already spoken for itself. Other family members tried, gently, to intervene. They asked whether we could talk it out, whether a compromise was possible, whether time might soften things. I listened. I thanked them for their concern, and I told them the truth. There's nothing to talk about. That answer made some people uncomfortable. They were accustomed to emotional negotiation, to movement, to compromise as proof of care. What they didn't understand was that I wasn't closing a door in anger. I was acknowledging that the door had been locked from the other side and that I no longer needed access. There was no heat in these conversations, no accusation, no recounting of past wounds. I refused to turn my life into a case file. I didn't explain how long this decision had been forming. I didn't describe the years of adjustment, the silence, the preparation. That story belonged to me. Instead, I held my boundary quietly. I respect his choice. I'm not asking him to change. I'm living my life. Those sentences were enough. People eventually stopped asking. Not because they understood, but because they sensed finality. Finality doesn't argue. It doesn't persuade. It simply remains. In the absence of drama, there was nothing to react against. That was intentional. I didn't want my departure to become a spectacle. I didn't want it framed as defiance or rebellion. I wanted it to be what it was: alignment. My father's authority had depended on my engagement. Once that engagement ended, there was no confrontation left to have. I noticed something else during this period, something unexpected. Without the emotional pull of constant evaluation, I became lighter, more present. My decisions required less effort. My relationships deepened without the need for translation. The quiet dominance people mistake for distance is often just self-possession. I didn't harden. I didn't withdraw from the world. I simply stopped participating in systems that required my self-erasure. There was grief. Yes, some nights were heavier than others. I missed the version of my father who might have chosen differently. I missed the ease of belonging without explanation, but I didn't miss the tension, and I didn't regret the choice, because confrontation without heat doesn't leave burn marks. It leaves clarity. And clarity, once established, doesn't require repetition. Who I am now is not a reaction to what I lost. It's a result of what I chose. For a long time, I thought identity was something negotiated, shaped by context, adjusted to maintain belonging. I believed that who I was depended, at least in part, on how well I fit into the systems around me. That belief dissolved quietly. Without the constant pressure to be legible to my father, I discovered a version of myself that didn't need to perform stability. I already had it. I just hadn't been living inside it fully. My life is calmer now, not because it's smaller, but because it's coherent. The parts of me that once lived in separate compartments, daughter, partner, professional, now exist in the same space without contradiction. I don't explain my choices as often, not because I'm guarded, but because they no longer feel provisional. My relationship is steady in a way that still surprises me. Not dramatic, not performative, just grounded. I'm loved without conditions that need constant monitoring. That kind of love re-educates you. It teaches you that loyalty doesn't require erasure, that respect doesn't depend on agreement, that intimacy can exist without control. Professionally, I've become more decisive. I trust my judgment without waiting for validation. I speak when necessary. I remain silent when it serves clarity, not comfort. People sometimes describe me as confident now. That word still feels imprecise. What I feel is alignment. Confidence implies performance. Alignment is internal. I carry grief differently now, too. It's no longer sharp. It doesn't define my days. It exists alongside gratitude for the life I built, for the choices I honored, for the version of myself I didn't abandon. I don't speak poorly of my father. I don't need to. He made the choice he believed was right. I made mine. What changed is that I stopped measuring my worth by his capacity to accept me. That shift didn't make me harder. It made it clearer. I still value family, still value connection, but I no longer confuse proximity with safety or tradition with love. The quiet dominance people sense now isn't something I cultivated intentionally. It emerged when I stopped apologizing for existing as I am. There's power in not needing to be understood by those who require you to stay small. There's freedom in choosing a life that doesn't ask you to fragment yourself for approval. I didn't lose my family because I loved the wrong person. I lost access to a structure that required obedience over authenticity. What I gained was the ability to live without asking whether my choices were acceptable. That trade was costly. It was also clean, and I would make it again.
Cảm ơn các bạn vì đã theo dõi đến cuối. Đừng quên ấn like, share và bật chuông để không bỏ lỡ những video mới nhất nhé. Hẹn gặp lại.